If I am reborn, I will never choose to love you again. She said it with blood on her lips and his hand in hers, and for the first time in all their years together, he had no answer ready. The battlefield was quiet the way only battlefields after slaughter are quiet, that particular silence that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath, embarrassed by what just happened on top of it. Snow had started falling. Soft, indifferent, the kind of snow that falls on the living and the dying without distinction, which is perhaps the most honest thing snow has ever done. She was lying against him. He was sitting up only because the arrow in his side had lodged against bone and was holding him in place like a grotesque pin. They were both past the point where pain registers as pain. It had become something else, something almost warm. His name was Lee Jun, Crown Prince of Joseon, a man who had spent the last 6 years of his life loving the wrong woman and ignoring the right one, which is a particular kind of stupidity available only to people who have never had to fight for anything until it was too late. Her name was Yoon Seo-yeon, Crown Princess, the woman he had married without wanting to, refused without justification, dismissed without cruelty but with something worse, indifference. A woman whose love he had never once bothered to examine because he was too busy being loved by someone else. And isn't that always how it goes? The love you choose blinds you to the love you were given. She was dying faster than him. He could tell by her breathing. Short, shallow, the pauses getting longer between each exhale, like a musician losing the rhythm. Seo-yeon. His voice came out wrong, cracked down the middle. She turned her head slightly. Her eyes were still clear. That was the thing about her that had always unsettled him. Even when he refused to admit it, her eyes were always clear, never desperate, never begging. Even now, "If I am reborn," she said, "I will never choose to love you again." He felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound. "Then if we are reborn," he said, after a silence that lasted several lifetimes, "let us fight this marriage." She looked at him. For just a moment, something passed between them that they had wasted 6 years not finding. Then her eyes closed. Then his did too. The snow kept falling. And this, listeners, is where most stories would end. But this one is only beginning. Asterisk if you are already feeling something, pause right now, hit the like button, and subscribe, because what comes next will make this opening feel like a warm afternoon. Stay with me. Asterisk. Go back. Go back 6 years, 7 months, and 14 days, to a morning in the Yoon family compound when Seo-yeon was 19 years old and still intact. She woke before dawn as she always did. Not because she was diligent or virtuous, though she was both, but because sleep had never been particularly kind to her. She would lie in the dark after the 4th hour and listen to the compound breathe. Servants moving, fires being stoked, the distant sound of her father's study, where candles burned all night because Minister Yoon Tae-young never fully slept. He rested the way birds rest. One eye always open, always watching the horizon for something with wings and teeth. She was his only daughter. This was, depending on the day, either a weapon or a wound. She dressed herself without calling for her maid. She had done this since she was 12, and the maids had stopped offering after the 3rd year of being refused. She sat at her mirror and looked at herself the way a general looks at a map, not with vanity but with assessment. What was useful? What was vulnerable? What could be hidden? She was beautiful in the way that makes men nervous, which is to say it was not soft beauty but structural beauty, the kind that does not require effort and therefore cannot be taken away. High cheekbones, a mouth that defaulted to composure, eyes like still water over deep cold. Her father had told her, once, when she was 15, "Your face is your most dangerous political asset. Use it accordingly." She had not entirely understood what he meant then. She was beginning to, because today, she was going to be presented at the palace as a candidate for crown princess. She was 19. The crown prince was 22. She had seen him once at a formal court ceremony 2 years prior, from a significant distance, in the way that girls of good family saw men of royal blood, as shapes, as symbols, as something that existed in a category entirely separate from ordinary human life. She had not thought about him again after that day. She had thought about many things. She had read every political text in her father's library that he had not bothered to hide from her, which was most of them, because he respected her intelligence even when he deployed it without her permission. She had studied the court factions with the same attention she gave to classical poetry. She understood, by the time she was 17, that Joseon was not a kingdom. It was a chessboard, and every family was playing, and the only question was whether you were moving pieces or being moved. The Yoon family was unambiguously moving pieces. Her father had 3 political enemies of serious consequence, 7 of moderate consequence, and one that he never spoke of by name, which she had come to understand meant that one was the most dangerous. The second prince's faction. Quiet, patient, long-game strategists who had been placing pieces on the board for decades. Her father intended to counter them by placing her inside the palace. She understood this. What she did not understand yet, what no one had thought to tell her, was that the game had more players than even her father knew, and some of them had been playing longer than he had been alive. She finished dressing. She looked at herself one more time. "Whatever happens today," she said to the woman in the mirror. "Do not flinch." The woman in the mirror did not flinch. The selection ceremony was precisely as ritualized and dehumanizing as palace ceremonies always are, which is to say it was exquisitely beautiful and made everyone feel like furniture. There were 11 candidates, daughters of the most powerful families in Joseon, arranged by rank and presented to the Queen Dowager, who would evaluate them with the particular exhausted expertise of a woman who had survived 30 years of court life and no longer had patience for anything that was not immediately useful. Joseon stood third in line. She observed the other candidates the way she observed everything, systematically. Most of them were nervous. Several were performing not nervous, which is a particular kind of conspicuous. One girl at the far end was crying very quietly, which Joseon found both understandable and tactically inadvisable. She was watching them when she became aware of being watched herself. She did not look immediately. This was a skill she had practiced, the ability to register attention without responding to it, which gives you several seconds of advantage while the watcher thinks they are undetected. She counted slowly to 3, identified the direction from the quality of the attention, and then turned her head with calibrated casualness. Crown Prince Lee Jun was not supposed to be there. The selection ceremony was traditionally attended only by the Queen Dowager and her court ladies. Princes, and particularly the Crown Prince, were expected to remain absent and accept the decision made on their behalf, as was tradition, as was custom, as was the particular cruelty of royal life that dressed itself in the language of ritual. He was there anyway. He was standing partially obscured by a lacquered screen at the far end of the hall, and he was not looking at the candidates in general. He was looking at her specifically, which she registered and filed without particular feeling. She looked back at him for exactly as long as it takes to confirm that eye contact has been made, and then she returned her gaze to the front. She did not think, "He is handsome," though he was. She did not think, "This is fate." She did not believe in fate. She thought, "He is here when he should not be," which means he is either defying protocol deliberately or he was given permission, and both of those tell me something. And then the ceremony continued, and she concentrated on standing correctly. What she could not see from where she stood was the woman standing just behind the Crown Prince. Positioned carefully in his shadow, one hand resting lightly on the screen for balance, eyes bright and fixed on the candidates with an expression that was not quite jealousy and not quite triumph and was something in between those two things that does not have a clean name. Her name was Hannah, but that comes later. The Queen Dowager chose Joseon before the ceremony was half finished. Not because of her beauty, though that was noted. Not because of her bearing, though that was also noted. But because when the Queen Dowager looked at her, really looked the way a woman who has survived 30 years of knives and smiles looks at another woman, she saw something she had not seen in a very long time in a young person. She saw someone who was not afraid of her. Not bravado. Not defiance. Not the false courage of a girl performing composure for approval. Just stillness. The kind that comes from having already made peace with difficult things. The Queen Dowager had known many beautiful, clever, politically useful girls. Most of them eventually broke or bent or became something else. She was tired of that. She was getting old and she wanted, before she died, to leave behind at least one woman in this palace who would not break. She pointed at Joseon and said, "That one." The ceremony was over. Joseon was told the news that evening. She was sitting in the garden. Her mother was inside somewhere, probably praying. Her father had already known. She could tell from the quality of his stillness when he came to find her. The particular satisfied calm of a man whose plan has executed correctly. "You were chosen," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You do not seem surprised." "I was the most qualified candidate." He almost smiled. Almost. Her father was not a man who smiled often. But when he almost did, it reached his eyes, which counted for more. "The crown prince does not want this marriage," he said. He said it the way you tell someone that rain is expected, as a fact, not an apology. "I know," she said again. "He is." Her father paused. This was unusual. He chose words the way he chose allies, carefully, and only when necessary. Attached to someone else. Joseon looked at the garden. The plum tree was blooming early. That was either a good omen or simply a warm winter, depending on whether you were the kind of person who believed in omens. "Who?" "A woman named Hannah, daughter of a minor noble family. She has been in his household for 3 years. Joseon processed this. "Does she love him?" Her father looked at her strangely. "That is not the relevant question." "It is to me." He did not answer that. After a moment, she said, "I will marry him." "Yes. And I will not pretend the marriage is something it is not." Her father was quiet for a long time. Then, "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that I understand what this marriage is for. It is political. I will fulfill its political function. But I will not perform happiness I do not have, and I will not make demands of a man whose heart is elsewhere." She paused. "That is not weakness. That is pragmatism." Her father looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before on his face, which she eventually identified as something close to guilt. "Joseon, I have made my peace with it, father. Do not mistake clarity for suffering." He left without saying anything else. She sat in the garden until the stars came out. She did not cry. She had already decided, somewhere deep and quiet inside herself, that she would enter this marriage with her eyes open, her spine straight, and her heart not closed, exactly, but carefully stored, like a document too important to leave exposed to weather. She would be the crown princess. She would be excellent at it. Whatever else happened, whatever the crown prince felt or did not feel, whatever political storms gathered, whatever the court decided to throw at her, she would not be a victim of any of it. She had made herself that promise in the garden under the early blooming plum tree. She would keep it for 6 years, and it would cost her everything. The wedding was magnificent. Weddings at the palace are always magnificent. This is part of their function, to make something that might be a transaction look, to the watching world, like a moment touched by heaven. The costumes cost enough to feed a village for a year. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Court officials wept with apparent sincerity. Citizens gathered outside the palace walls and cheered because they were supposed to, and because a royal wedding is a story, and humans love stories even when they are sad ones. Joseon wore red and gold and moved through each ritual element with the precision of someone who had studied and rehearsed every step, which she had. She had practiced the ceremony in her family home, in secret for 2 weeks, not because she was anxious, but because she refused to make a single visible error on a day that the entire kingdom would be watching. She did not make a single visible error. The crown prince stood beside her through all of it. He was beautiful, she noticed. This was not a political assessment, just an honest one. He was tall with the kind of face that is used to being looked at, and he wore ceremony the way most men wear ordinary clothing without thinking about it. He had grown up in this. It showed. He did not look at her during the ceremony. Not once. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. Catalogued it, filed it, did not let it land anywhere it could become a wound. On the 3rd day of the ceremony, when they were finally led to the wedding chamber, she expected awkwardness. She had prepared for awkwardness. She had not prepared for what actually happened. He stopped at the entrance to the chamber. He turned to her. His eyes, for the first time, met hers directly, and she was briefly surprised by what was in them. Not cruelty, not contempt, but something almost like apology, which was, in a way, worse. "I will not come in," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I mean no disrespect," he said. "This is not about you." "I know," she said. "It is never about me." He flinched slightly. This surprised her. She had not intended it to be a wound, only an observation, but apparently it landed like one. She stepped into the chamber alone. She sat in the center of the room for a long time in all her wedding finery, listening to the palace settle around her, and she thought, well, here is the life you chose. Make something of it. Then she removed her hairpins, laid them in a neat row, and went to sleep. Stop for a moment. If you can feel the particular loneliness of that scene. A woman sleeping alone in her wedding chamber with her hairpins in a neat row because order is the only thing she can control right now. Then you are exactly where the story needs you. Like and subscribe if you want to know what happens when this woman finally gets angry. Trust me, it is worth the wait. The first year of the marriage was an architecture of avoidance. The crown prince was not unkind to her in public. He was correct, formally courteous. He attended the required joint appearances with the practiced composure of someone who has learned to perform whatever the situation demands, which she recognized because she was doing the same thing. In private, they did not speak. She had her apartments. He had his. In the 4th month, Hannah entered the palace as the crown prince's second consort. Joseon had been the one to suggest it. This surprised everyone, including. She would admit privately only to herself. She had gone to the crown prince 3 months after the wedding and requested a formal meeting, which he had granted with visible surprise. She sat across from him in the formal receiving room of his apartments. Both of them straight-backed, properly distanced, absurd in their formality given that they were legally married. "I want to make a proposal," she said. He waited. "You love Hannah," she said, not as a question. His jaw tightened. "That is not a matter for discussion. It is a matter for practicality. You will not give me an heir. The court will eventually force the issue. The easiest solution is to bring her in as a secondary consort." She kept her voice neutral, clinical, the way her father spoke about politics. "She can give you a son. The succession is secured. The pressure on us both is reduced." He stared at her. "Why would you do this?" he asked. He seemed genuinely unable to understand it. She considered several answers. The honest one was too complicated. The political one was too cold. She chose something in the middle. "Because I am the crown princess," she said. "Not the only woman in the palace. And because I would rather manage this situation than be managed by it." He looked at her for a long time. "You are very strange," he said at last. "I have been told," she said. That was the longest real conversation they had in the first year. Hannah arrived in the 2nd month of spring. She was soft in the way that does not mean weak, the kind of softness that is deliberate, curated, a language spoken specifically to a certain kind of man. She had large eyes that went slightly wide when she was addressed, giving a constant impression of warm surprise. Her voice was low and musical. She wore colors that made the crown prince's apartments feel warmer. She was, Joseon noted, exceptionally good at being loved. There is a particular kind of performance that looks nothing like performance, and Hannah had mastered it. The way she laughed quietly, as if laughing was something intimate and only for him. The way she listened, tilted forward, eyes attentive, like every word he said was a small gift. The way she touched his arm when she was worried, so briefly, so naturally that it seemed like instinct rather than choice. Joseon watched this from appropriate distances and thought, "She is very skilled." She did not let herself think about what it meant that a woman who lived in this palace, in this specific position, would need to be this skilled. She watched Hannah with the crown prince, and she watched Hannah when the crown prince was not watching Hannah, and there was a difference. She filed this difference in the back of her mind, where she kept things she was not ready to examine yet. In the autumn of that year, Hannah became pregnant. In the spring, she gave birth to a son. The crown prince wept when he held his son for the first time. Joseon stood in the corridor outside and heard it. Not the sound of crying exactly, but the sound of a man breaking open in the good way that some men do when they first hold their children, when they are required by love to be suddenly enormous and suddenly terrified at once. She stood in the corridor and she let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, everything she had been carefully storing. Then she folded it back up and walked away. She had things to do. Here is something the Crown Prince did not know about his wife. She attended, secretly, 3 meetings per month with her father's network of court informants. She had been doing this since the 6th month of her marriage. She had identified, by the 3rd month, a pattern in the political attacks on the Crown Prince. Motions in court that questioned his judgment. Rumors seeded through the civil service that suggested incompetence. Indirect challenges to his decisions from officials who had no obvious reason to challenge him. The attacks were subtle, careful, the work of someone patient. She recognized the pattern because her father had taught her to recognize it. He called it the slow blade. Not the dramatic assassination or the direct confrontation, but the 10,000 small cuts that weaken a man before anyone notices he is bleeding. She began countering it. She used her father's informants to identify which officials were being bribed and by whom. She had her father apply pressure, never overtly, always through intermediaries 3 steps removed. She identified 2 assassination plots before they materialized and had them dismantled so quietly that no one, including the Crown Prince, ever knew they had existed. She did this without telling him. Not because she wanted his gratitude, she did not. But because telling him would require explaining how she knew, which would reveal her network, which would compromise its effectiveness. And because some part of her, buried deep under the pragmatism, knew that he would not believe her anyway. He would think she was manipulating him. He did not know her well enough to understand that she did not manipulate. She managed. There was a difference. The Crown Prince, meanwhile, spent his mornings in court and his evenings with Hannah, and believed, insofar as he thought about it, that his political position was relatively stable. He was not stupid. He was simply looking in the wrong direction. This is the thing about people who have always been the center of someone's devotion. They do not think to look for protection because they have never had to ask for it. It simply appears. Like magic. Like grace. They assume the world is being managed. They do not think to ask who is doing the managing. The 2nd year passed. Then the 3rd. The Crown Prince's son grew into a loud, healthy, cheerful child who called Joseon Big Mother, in the way that court children are taught to address the primary wife. And she was unexpectedly fond of him. He was bright and uncomplicated, which felt, in the palace, like a small miracle. She helped him with his letters when his own mother was busy. She taught him 3 proverbs she had always found useful. She did not love him exactly, but she was kind to him in the specific way that people who have decided not to need things are kind to small creatures who have no politics yet. The 4th year, the 5th year, the court attacks continued, escalating incrementally, carefully, and she continued countering them. Her father's network grew more sophisticated. She became better at reading the patterns. She could identify, by the 4th year, the architect of most of the attacks, though she had not yet confirmed it definitively. The 2nd prince. Lee Hyun. He was 3 years younger than the Crown Prince. Quiet. Scholarly. The kind of man who seems unthreatening right until the moment he is not. He had spent years building a faction in the court so slowly and so quietly that most officials did not notice they were in it until they were already committed. He reminded Seo-yun of her father in the worst possible way, the same patient intelligence, but without any of the underlying code of honor that made her father, for all his ruthlessness, ultimately predictable. She told her father about her suspicions in the 5th year. He confirmed them in the 6th. What neither of them could confirm, what she was not yet willing to ask directly, was the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the 2nd year, quiet as a stone, heavy as a stone. Hannah. The timing of her arrival in the Crown Prince's household. 3 years before the marriage, her father had said. Which meant she had arrived when Lee Jun was the Crown Prince but had not yet been formally betrothed. When he was young and alone, and this was the cruelest part, probably lonely in the specific way that royal men are lonely, surrounded by people but touched by almost no one. She had arrived at exactly the right moment. She had been exactly the right kind of woman to fill exactly the right kind of loneliness. This did not happen by accident. In the 6th year, everything collapsed. The collapse did not happen suddenly. Collapses never do, regardless of what they look like from the outside. They are always the result of years of pressure meeting one structural weakness at the wrong moment. The structural weakness was a man named Official Beck, who was terrified of dying, which is understandable, and expressed this fear by telling the Second Prince's faction everything he had witnessed and overheard for 4 years, which is not. What he told them, among other things, was that a northern border general had been in quiet communication with a rebel faction for 2 years. What he did not tell them, what he genuinely did not know, was that these communications had been fabricated. The letters were forgeries. The witnesses were paid. But by the time it could have been untangled, the story had its own momentum. And the story, in its telling, implicated the Crown Prince. Not directly. Never directly. The Second Prince's faction was too careful for direct implication. What they did was colder and more elegant. They ensured that the forgeries were designed to suggest that the Crown Prince had known about the communications. Not that he had authorized them. Not that he had initiated them. Simply that he had known and said nothing. In court, this is sufficient. In court, knowledge of treason that goes unreported is itself treason. And the beauty of this accusation is that it is almost impossible to disprove. How do you prove you did not know something? You cannot produce an absence of knowledge. You can only assert it, and assertion without evidence is simply noise. The court erupted. The Queen Dowager was furious, not at the Crown Prince, but at the situation, which is a different kind of fury. She sent for Joseon before she sent for anyone else. Joseon arrived to find the Queen Dowager standing at her window, which was unusual. She was usually seated. "They want to try him," the Queen Dowager said without turning around. "The faction has enough votes to force a formal investigation." "They are manufacturing evidence," Joseon said. The Queen Dowager turned, looked at her. "You know this. I have suspected for some time." "Then why?" "Because I could not prove it. Not in court. The forgeries are good." She paused. "I have been working on it. I need more time." The Queen Dowager studied her. "The court does not have more time to give. They will force the investigation within the week. And if the investigation opens—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. If the investigation opened, the Crown Prince would be removed from the succession pending its resolution, which would take months, during which the Second Prince's faction would have time to deepen the forgeries, manufacture more evidence, and potentially, she was being precise, not dramatic, arrange for the Crown Prince not to survive the investigation. "The faction that drives this investigation," Joseon said carefully, "wants the Crown Prince removed from the succession. The surest way to prevent that is to remove the grounds for investigation. We cannot disprove a negative." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "But we can make it irrelevant. If the Crown Prince goes to the border himself, leads a campaign, demonstrates unambiguous loyalty in action, the court loses its grounds. A man cannot be tried for secret rebel sympathies while he is publicly fighting those same rebels." The Queen Dowager was very still. "You are asking him to go to war," she said. "I am suggesting it as an alternative to being destroyed by a political process he cannot win by standing still." A long silence. "He will not thank you for this." "He does not have to thank me for it." He did not thank her for it. He was told by official court messenger, in the formal language of court decree, that he was to lead a military campaign to the northern border to address the rebel incursion, thereby demonstrating his loyalty to the kingdom and clearing suspicion from his name. He came to her apartments that night for the first time in 6 years. She had been expecting him. She was sitting at her desk. She did not stand when he entered, which was, technically, a breach of formality, but she had decided some time ago that she would not perform submission to a man who would not see her. He was angry. She could see it in the way he was holding himself, that very controlled stillness that means the opposite of calm. "This was you," he said. "Yes." "You went to the Queen Dowager." "Yes." "Without consulting me." She looked at him steadily. If I had come to you first, you would have refused. You would have called it an overreach. You would have insisted on handling it through direct confrontation in court, which would have failed, because the evidence against you, though manufactured, is currently stronger than your defense. His jaw was tight. You had no right. I had every right. I am the crown princess, not a statue. She kept her voice level, but there was an edge under it that had been building for 6 years. You are being destroyed by a faction that has been working for years to remove you from the succession. I have been watching it. I have been counterworking it. For 6 years I have been managing your survival in a court you believe is merely difficult while it is actually trying to kill you, and I have done it quietly and without your knowledge because I knew you would not accept my help, and because I did not require your acceptance to act. He stared at her. What do you mean? He said slowly. You have been managing my survival. She told him. Not everything. Not the full architecture of it. But enough, the informant network, the assassination plots, the pattern of court attacks, her suspicions about the second prince's faction. She laid it out in the same precise language she used for everything, without drama or self-congratulation, as though she were presenting a report. He was silent for a very long time when she finished. Why? He said. Because you are the crown prince, she said. Because the alternative to your survival is political chaos that will cost thousands of lives. Because... She stopped. Because what? She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was something between them. Because I made a choice to be your wife, she said. And I do not make choices I am not prepared to honor. He looked at her for a long time. There was something shifting behind his eyes. She watched it and did not let herself want anything from it. I will go to the border, he said. I know. He left. Asterisk, can I ask you something? How many times in your life has someone protected you without telling you? How many times has someone quietly made sure you were okay without needing credit for it? Think about that while you keep listening. And if you feel something, comment below. Tell me. This story is better when we're in it together. Asterisk. He left for the northern border in the 4th month of the year with a military retinue of 3,000 soldiers and the formal endorsement of the court, who were collectively relieved to have a solution to the problem they had partially created. Hannah wept at his departure. Beautiful, controlled weeping, the kind that photographs well, in the way that all of Hannah's public emotions looked as though they had been considered for how they would look. Joseon stood at the formal departure ceremony in her capacity as crown princess and said nothing. She wore deep blue. She kept her hands folded. The crown prince, mounted, paused at the gate. He looked back. She did not know if he was looking at her or at Hannah. She did not look to confirm. 3 days after he left, she began preparing to follow him. This was not a decision she made impulsively. She had been considering it since the night he came to her apartments. She had weighed the risks with the same systematic care she applied to everything. The risks were significant. Traveling to a war camp as a woman, in disguise, through territory that was not entirely secure. The physical danger was real. The political risk was greater. If it became known that the crown princess had abandoned the palace without permission, the scandal would be substantial. But here is what she had concluded in the quiet of her own mind, in the way that people come to certain truths only when they strip away everything except what is real. If he died, she was destroyed anyway. Not politically. Politically, a crown princess who outlived her husband had options. But she had been watching herself for 6 years, watching herself not feel and not want and carefully manage every emotion into usefulness. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that something had happened that she had not planned for and could not entirely manage. She did not want him to die. Not because he had been a good husband. He had been an absent one. Not because he had been kind to her. He had been indifferent to her, which is its own particular unkindness. But because somewhere in 6 years of watching him, of knowing him from angles he did not know she was watching from, of protecting a man who did not know he was being protected, somewhere in all of that, she had made the error she had promised herself she would not make. She had come to understand him. And understanding, she had learned, is the door through which caring enters without being invited. She did not call it love. She was not ready to call it love. She called it a thing she was not prepared to lose. She told no one except one trusted maid, who looked at her with wide, terrified eyes and said, "Your Highness, this is—" "I know what it is," Joseon said. "Prepare the horses, and find me appropriate clothing." The road to the northern border was 14 days hard travel. She made it in 11, which required a pace that was uncomfortable and a level of physical endurance that she had not known, until this specific journey, that she possessed. She had always been aware of her mind. She had not thought much about her body. She was rethinking that now, saddle-sore and cold, navigating mountain passes with 2 guards sworn to silence and a disguise that would fool anyone not paying careful attention. She arrived at the war camp at dusk on the 11th day. The camp was larger than she had expected. A sprawling military settlement that smelled of horses and smoke and food and the particular smell of men under sustained stress, which is not an unpleasant smell exactly but is unmistakably alive. She moved through it with her head down and the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to be invisible when necessary. She found the crown prince in the command tent. He was alone. This surprised her. His senior officers were gone. She could hear them in the adjacent tent, voices low and urgent. He was standing over a map table, and he was very still in the way he had been still in her apartments, but this was different. This stillness was not anger. He looked like a man who had received news and had not yet decided what to do with it. She stepped into the tent. He turned, looked at her. The stillness broke. Not into anger, this time, but into something more disorganized. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something she could not immediately identify. "How?" He stopped. Started again. "What are you doing here?" She pulled back the travel-worn hood of her outer robe. She was aware, not looking her best. 11 days of hard travel had done things to her hair that were not improved by the disguise. She did not care about this. "I came," she said, "because there are things you need to know, and because the roads between here and the palace are not safe, which means a messenger is not reliable. You rode 11 days, 14 at normal pace. I rode faster." She moved toward the map table. "What has happened? You were standing like something had broken when I came in." He stared at her. Then something in him gave way, just slightly, just enough, and he turned and picked up a letter from the table and held it out to her without speaking. She took it. "Read it. Read it again." The letter was unsigned. It had been delivered to the camp that morning by a rider from the south, from a source within the second prince's household. It contained, in dry, precise language, as if written by someone who wanted to be sure there was no ambiguity, everything. Hannah's recruitment by the second prince. 4 years before she entered the crown prince's household. The original plan, to place her as an intimate influence to gather information, to steer him subtly away from advisors who might see the second prince's faction clearly. The ongoing communication between her and the faction strategist for the past 6 years. The letter also contained something else. It contained the information that Hannah had, 3 days ago, sent a detailed account of the crown prince's battle plans to the second prince's man. The plans were already compromised. Joseon lowered the letter. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was the most honest thing she had ever seen on his face, which is to say it was entirely unguarded, entirely open, the expression of a man who has been struck somewhere central and has not yet had time to build the protection back up. "She was never—" He started. Stopped. "No," Joseon said, as gently as she had ever said anything. The silence that followed was very long. She watched him understand in real time the arithmetic of 6 years. Everything he had believed, everything he had trusted. The particular, intimate, ongoing cruelty of having been loved by someone who was doing it as a job, who had been instructed to love him, who had perhaps done it so well that even she had eventually been confused about the nature of it. Or perhaps not, perhaps it had always been purely professional and wasn't that worse. She watched him and she did not say, "I knew. I suspected. I warned you with my silence even when I could not warn you with words." She did not say any of that. She put the letter back on the table. "The battle plan needs to change tonight," she said. He looked at her. "Tonight," she said again. "Before dawn they can act on what she sent them. We have time, but not much. Call your senior officers. He kept looking at her. June. It was the first time she had used his name without his title. Came out very quietly, almost by accident. He blinked. Call your officers, she said. He did. What happened next was the most intensive 6 hours of Seoyeon's life, which is saying something given the 6 years that had preceded it. She sat in the command tent while the Crown Prince's senior officers, initially horrified and then, when they understood the situation, grimly focused, reconstructed the battle plan from the foundation up. She was not supposed to be there. She was a woman in a war camp, which in Joseon is not a thing that exists officially. She did not leave. The officers, to their credit, stopped looking at her like a problem within the first hour when they realized she was following the strategic discussion faster than 2 of the 3 of them and had, twice, identified a vulnerability that no one else had seen. The Crown Prince watched her across the table and said nothing, but she could feel him watching. At the 4th hour, when the reconstruction was substantially complete, he said quietly, "Where did you learn military strategy?" "My father's library," she said without looking up from the map. "There are no women allowed in the military academies." "No. There are also no women officially running political intelligence networks. And yet." She looked up. "I read what was available. I asked questions when I could. I paid attention when people spoke about things they assumed I was not listening to." He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me several," she said. "We can discuss it when we are not in danger of being killed." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The planning continued. The battle came at dawn. She had not planned to be in it. She had planned to remain in the command tent and function as a second pair of eyes on the communications, monitoring the dispatches, tracking the developing situation, providing a comm center in the chaos. This was a reasonable plan. This was a practical plan. What was not practical was the moment, in the 2nd hour of engagement, when the Crown Prince's personal guard was reduced by an ambush she had failed to anticipate. Not from the direction she had predicted but from an angle that the compromised battle plan had specifically been designed to expose. She was watching from the command tent when it happened. She made a decision in about 3 seconds. She put on a guard's outer armor. It was too large and she could not tie it properly, but it covered her. Took a sword from the weapons rack with both hands because it was heavy for someone who had never used one in earnest, and walked out of the tent. She had studied swordsmanship in a theoretical sense. She had watched enough training sessions over the years that she understood the mechanics. She had, in fact, practiced alone with a training sword on occasion, because she had decided that knowing things only theoretically was a limitation she wanted to reduce wherever possible. She had not expected to be tested on it. She was not elegant. She was not graceful. What she was angry, in the specific focused way of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has finally run out of patience. And it turned out that this is worth something in a fight. The Crown Prince found her in the middle of the engagement and grabbed her arm with a grip that was probably supposed to be furious but felt something like panicked. "What are you doing?" "Keeping you alive," she said, which was technically accurate, as she had just dealt with a man who had been approaching him from behind. He stared at her. "Go back to the tent. If you die here," she said, and her voice was very steady and very clear even over the noise of the battle. "What becomes of me? A childless crown princess. No heir. No political protection. Everything I have spent 6 years building falls apart." She met his eyes. "So we either live together or die together. Those are the options." He looked at her. For a moment that was somehow very still despite the chaos around it. Then he shifted his grip from her arm to her hand and said, "Stay close." She stayed close. They fought side by side for 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, the rebel force had been broken and the Crown Prince's position was militarily secure, and they were both standing in the middle of a field covered in mud and blood and snow that had started falling, and Seoyeon was holding her arm where an arrow had grazed it, and he was pressing his hand to his side where a blade had caught him, and they were both breathing hard. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You said we live together," he said. "Or die together," she confirmed. "Those were the options. I would like," he said carefully, "to revise the options in favor of the first one. That is the first wise thing you have said to me since we met. He laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, which she had never heard before. It was a good sound. She noted this and let herself, for just a moment, simply have the noting. Then they were moving again, getting to the medical area, dealing with the immediate requirements of survival, wounds and reports, and the logistics of aftermath. She did what needed doing. He did what needed doing. Occasionally they were close enough to speak, and they spoke in the shorthand of people who have just been through the same thing together, which is a language that builds fast and goes deep. This is how 6 years of silence broke. Not in a declaration. Not in an apology, though that came later. In the small, practical, alive language of two people who had just almost died and were revising their assessment of each other accordingly. The wound in his side was more serious than it had looked. She found this out when he stopped moving with the purposeful efficiency of the last 3 hours and sat down heavily against a rock and went gray. She was beside him in 2 steps. "How bad?" she said. "It is fine. How bad?" He looked at her with an expression that, for once, had nothing strategic in it. "The blade went deeper than I thought." She checked. It had. They were getting him back to the camp, getting the medic, doing what could be done. But she sat beside him while the medic worked, and she held his hand, which she had not planned to do, which her hand did without consulting her, and he held hers back with a grip that was steadier than his face. "Seo-yun," he said. "Don't talk," she said. "Seo-yun." She looked at him. "Why did you really come here?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was not prepared," she said at last, "for what my life would be without you in it. Even though you have not been in it, in any real sense, for 6 years. She kept her eyes on the medic's hands. "This was an error in my reasoning that I have not fully resolved." He was quiet. "I made an error too," he said. "A long one. Several." "Yes," the medic finished. He closed his eyes. His grip on her hand did not loosen. She sat beside him in the cold and the snow, and she thought, "This is the first honest hour we have ever had, and we are having it at the possible end of both our lives, which is the particular irony available to people who wait too long for things." She did not say this out loud. She sat with him in the dark and the cold, and she let herself have the feeling of his hand in hers, and she did not put it away. He did not die that night. She allowed herself relief, briefly, then got back to work. But 2 days later, in a second engagement that no one had predicted, a desperate last assault by a rebel faction that had regrouped faster than expected, they were both caught again. This time was different. This time they were separated in the chaos, and she was in the open, and there was an archer she did not see until the arrow was already moving. It struck her shoulder, not her chest, which should have been, and in another circumstance would have been, manageable. But the ground was iced and she fell wrong, and she did not see the second soldier until he was already there, and the blade that caught her along the left side was serious in the way that the medic's face, 20 minutes later, communicated without words. She was aware of this but filed it under things to deal with after. The Crown Prince found her before the battle was over. She was still moving, technically, because she had decided she would keep moving, but she was aware that this was costing something she could not replace. He reached her, and his face did the thing it had done when he read the letter. Broke open, all the protection gone, entirely unguarded. "Seo-yun." "I am standing," she said, which was true. "You are." "I am standing," she said again. "Help me to that rock." He helped her to the rock. He held her. The battle was finishing around them. The rebel force was breaking, the sound of it shifting from close to distant. Snow was falling again. She was leaning against him, and she was very cold, and she was honest enough with herself to know what that cold meant. He knew too. She could feel it in the way he was holding her, tighter than anything in 6 years of official distance, the way you hold something when you understand you are not going to be able to hold it much longer. "I was wrong about everything," he said. "Yes," she said. "Seo-yun." I know," she said. They were quiet. She was getting colder. The pain was receding into something that felt, paradoxically, like warmth. She had read about this in a medical text once. She recognized it. "If I am reborn," she said, and her voice was steady, though quietly, "I will never choose to love you again." He made a sound that had no language in it. "If we are reborn," he said when he had his voice back, "let us fight this marriage." She looked at him. Their eyes met, really met, the way they had been failing to meet for 6 years. "If we fight it," she said. "Who wins?" He was crying. She noted this without judgment. "I think," he said, "we might both lose, in the best possible way." She looked at the sky. The snow was beautiful. She had always liked snow. She had not told him this because they had not talked about small things, only about politics and survival and necessity. She had not told him about the early blooming plum tree either, or the 30 seconds in the corridor outside Hannah's birthing room, or any of the 100 small things that constitute knowing a person. She thought, "There is so much we did not say." And then the thought after that was softer and simpler, and it was the last thought she had. Not this time. She woke up. Sunlight. The smell of plum blossom. She sat up very fast, which sent the room tilting, and grabbed the edge of the bed, and looked around with wide eyes at walls she recognized and light she recognized and the particular quality of a room she had not been in since she was 19 years old. Her hands. She looked at her hands. Young. 19. Unmarked. Her heart was slamming. Outside the window, she could hear the compound waking up. Servants. Her mother's voice, distant. The sound of her father's study. Candles burning, even in daylight, because he never fully slept. She pressed both hands against the floor mat, solid and real beneath her, and she thought, "I know what day this is." Today was the day of the royal selection ceremony. Today was the day she had first seen the crown prince across a formal hall, through a lacquered screen, from a distance. Today was the day everything had started. She sat in her room in her family compound and she breathed very carefully, in and out, and she organized what she knew. She was back. She had been back exactly to the beginning of the story. And this time, she thought, and something in her that had been stored for a very long time was moving, uncertain, beginning to understand what it had not understood before. This time she knew everything. She knew about the second prince. She knew about Hannah. She knew about the forgeries and the slow blade and the war and the snow. She knew what 6 years of managing survival from the outside looked like, and she knew what it cost, and she knew what you missed when you were spending all your energy on the architecture of survival instead of on the person inside it. She also knew, and this was the part she was still working out, sitting on the floor of her childhood room with the plum blossom smell drifting through the window. She knew what he looked like when he laughed for the first time, when he was genuinely surprised into happiness, when his face broke open and all the protection was gone. She knew now what was under all the formality. She stood up. She went to her mirror. The girl looking back at her was 19 and unmarked and had not yet made any of the choices that came after. But she had all the knowledge of the woman who had. "Different," she said to the mirror. The mirror said nothing back, but the word landed in the room with a kind of weight. Not heavy, exactly. More like the weight of a door opening. She thought about the plum tree. She thought about his laugh. She thought about his hand in hers in the snow. She thought, "If we fight this marriage, who wins?" And she thought, for the first time, the thing she had not let herself think before, the thing she had been storing under pragmatism and management and the careful language of necessity. Maybe both. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she smiled. It was not the smile of a girl preparing to be chosen. It was the smile of a woman who had already died once and come back knowing exactly what she was fighting for. She straightened. She smoothed her robes. She lifted her chin. The selection ceremony was this morning. The crown prince would be at the edge of the hall, partially behind a lacquered screen, looking at the candidates. This time, when their eyes met, and they would meet, she was certain. She would not look away after 3 seconds with calibrated casualness. She would look at him. Really look. Let him see. Not the political asset, not the minister's daughter, not the composed and careful candidate, but the woman who had fought beside him in the snow, who had protected him without being asked, who had said, "I was not prepared for what my life would be without you," in a war camp with mud on her face and blood on her arm, who had died holding his hand and come back to do everything differently. She would look at him until he saw all of it. And then she would see what he did. Outside, her mother's voice calling her name. Sunlight moving through the window. The plum tree in the garden. Blooming early, white and perfect and alive. This time was going to be different. This time she was going to fight. Asterisk stop. Breathe. Tell me in the comments. Did you feel that ending? The girl who died in the snow and woke up at the beginning with all the weapons she didn't have the first time. Asterisk. Asterisk part 2 is where she rewrites everything. The second prince won't see her coming. Hannah doesn't know she's already been seen. The crown prince is about to meet a woman who already knows his story, and she is going to make him earn her this time. Asterisk. Asterisk if you need part 2 to exist, comment reborn right now. Like this video. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Because she has been dead and she has come back. And she is done being patient. Asterisk. Done being invisible. Done protecting someone who could not see her. This time she is going to make sure he looks. End of part 1.